SOS is going to come in. I'm going to attempt to be here on Monday. I have 2 midterms, so we're going to try. But I will be there on the Tuesday one, and we'll have the Vice President of Academics, and the President is also going to be here, and we're going to be holding a review session, which has statistics, sample questions that were written by Lauren, sample questions that weren't written by Lauren, sample questions throughout all the years. We've compiled this review session to try to help and do as most beneficial as possible for all of you. So we really highly recommend you come to either the Monday or Tuesday one. I was told, but just come to one of them and you start writing out the friends because we really think we're going to help you and it's on the line. So please do come and we hope to see you there. Don't clap on me.
All right, thanks so much. All righty. So definitely make use. I organized these study sessions for test 2 based on your feedback on the test 1 little feedback question you gave at the end of the test. So hopefully you'll find them useful. The questions, as per your feedback, again, I did make 20 multiple choice questions, roughly. So we'll be going through those as well after next week after lecture. That'll be part of the test review. And they are more challenging than the practice questions that I kind of came up with just before the lecture for the test 1 kind of mini review that we had. I know you said those were a little bit too easy and didn't reflect what was on the test. So I tried to make multiple choice ones that I think are more equivalent to ones that will actually be on the test this time. And then, so again, this week we have no tutorials. Again, this was the week when I thought our test 2 was going to be, but we did get moved, once again as a reminder, to Wednesday, February 27th at 5 p.m. in HL 170, a nice, we're in an actual exam room, so we'll have lots of space. So there's no tutorials this week because I didn't want to change the schedule or anything, but we have tutorials next week. And so next week's tutorials will be a test review as well. So lots of test review. You'll have it from me and Sarah and Ujwal from SOS next Monday after class and Tuesday if you want to come to that as well in the AA 112 at 8 p.m. But it'll be the same thing. And then again in tutorials next week. Jason, our lead TA, accidentally made a little announcement today, which I notified him of, and some of you notified me about. The grades are being finalized, so they should be released after 6 p.m. or so today for assignment number 2. So we're still working on the final grades, but when you see the grades online also, know that the modules that you completed are separate from the assignment itself. So you'll see you'll see 1 grade out of 80, and then you'll see 4 grades out of, which you should already see, I think. So you already have your module grades. So you'll have 4 grades each out of 5. Add that to whatever you get on assignment 2. So if on assignment 2, let's say you get 60 out of 80, add the 4 modules to that, and that's what you have out of 100 or out of 10%. But Jason will put that in an announcement, because I just don't know how to add those together on Quercus. On an Excel I did. So right now, I think the average in total, I think Jason will talk about this, but the average, including the module grades, is about 70 out of 100. Whereas it was closer to 65 or 66 for assignment 1. So we're making progress. So it's good. They were very happy overall. And we're just finalizing the global feedback for this evening. Or they're finalizing it because I'm up here. Unless my brain is over there. Okay, so I was really looking forward to this week. I'm happy that I didn't have to wait until after the test. For those that I've kind of talked to more personally about my own life as a grad student, sociologist, professor, instructor, or whatever, I've said, my main area, aside from sociological theory and social psychology, where I kind of apply these ideas, is to deviance. So we will see this week, I've taught a whole course just on this topic, and many of my courses have been about deviance more generally. But I'm going to try to fit in, my view on this topic and what the textbook teaches you. So this week is kind of an introduction to criminology, which involves, as we'll see, another famous binary, which we'll get to, of the distinction between crime and deviance. And when I say deviance, I'm not saying deviants. It sounds almost the same. But so a deviant, as you'll see, is someone who is disobeying social norms. Deviance, with a CE at the end, is the study of norm and rule and moral rebellion or disobeyal. And so we'll see this week again that even though criminology is a separate subfield, is a separate discipline. I've talked to students that want to major in criminology at the St. George campus, because it is actually its own program there. And then there's, I think, society, ethics, and law, or something like that at the Mississauga campus. My go-to course before this course was the sociology of policing, which I taught almost 10 times. So if you have any questions about criminology, what you could do with it, how you could maybe double major in that and sociology, or how you could just find deviance and crime courses across the three campuses within a sociology major or specialist, do not hesitate to contact me at any point, because I've answered a lot of questions about that stuff in my time here. Okay. All right, so before we get started, here's just a nice quote from Sutherland and Cressy, two major sociological criminologists, just kind of defining the scope of the field as a sociologist would see it. So what is criminology? It is, quote, the body of knowledge regarding crime as a social phenomenon. So right away you'll see this is we're going to treat this as another substantive topic. So we looked at culture, we looked at gender, racialization, we're going to look at media. Here we're treating crime and criminology as one of these subfields. It includes within its scope the process of making laws, breaking laws, and reacting to how laws are broken. So key in this, which we'll see again, which I mentioned. Sorry, can you just be quiet in the back? Thanks. So the sociology of crime and deviance, we disaggregate crime from deviance. So this approach, you should see, is very similar to the way our theoretical schools in the discipline have been broken up. So the study of crime, as we'll see, is interested in more measurable, tangible, objective social facts in a Durkheimian sense. The origins of sociology and the whole quantitative and qualitative approach to studying the world came out, again, of Durkheim, thinking, we can study collective behavior and even individual personality by looking at laws and codes that are present in society. So criminology was key to the formation of sociology. Durkheim, even though he's a sociologist, again, his key work was on suicide, one of his key works, and his rules of sociological method, his famous methodological treatise, was, he said, we can turn to a society's laws and their norms and their written codes of conduct as representing what he called the kind of collective consciousness or personality of that society. So criminology, as we'll kind of go over the history of it, but it started very much the same way. It started in the Enlightenment. It took off around the Industrial Revolution, and central questions, just remember Comte thought society went from religious to philosophical and then to scientific. We'll see that this trend continued as well in criminology and among sociologists who study crime. So again, it's a very sociology, criminology, and anthropology are three extremely similar disciplines. So that's why we You'll often see me drawing connections between them. So crime, again, is relatively objective. So a given society will designate certain behaviors as criminal. So things like murder, incest, so just thinking of Canada, murder, incest, like pedophilia, so all sorts of umbrella sexual paraphilias and acts, things involving physical coercion, theft. There's more public and private designations, but I think we all have a pretty good sense of what crimes are. So again, the study of crime very much lends itself to Durkheim and the study of objective, tangible, external, social facts. Now deviance, on the other hand, is much more interpretive. So when you get to things, again, the schools in sociology, you may think here more of Weber, George Herbert Mead, Charles Horton Cooley. So deviance, the study of deviance, is when sociologists and criminologists and any kind of interested person catalogs and thinks about how members of a society react to norm violations more broadly. So again, a crime is a legal kind of rejection or misuse of a norm, right? So when you do a crime, it's not just, okay, you disobeyed a norm, you went against the law and it's a punishable offense. Deviance includes actual, disobeying of laws, things that could get you arrested or give you a fine. So in the case of this course, academic integrity, it's a crime, although obviously not like a major crime, but it's an institutional crime, an ethical crime, so you get penalties, late penalties. Deviance, however, is any sort of norm or expected code of conduct that is violated. So I gave examples throughout the course of what kind of deviant behavior would be. It would be like if I just started yelling at the top of my lungs here, I would be deviating a kind of, everyday norm that you would have about professors or lecturers at the front of the room speaking at, some sort of relative pitch. I'm trying to speak at the volume that I think people expect. So I would also be being deviant if I was whispering. Oftentimes people think that people that talk very quietly are being passive-aggressive because they're kind of forcing you to get close and ask them, what are you saying, and pay extra attention to them. So we'll get to the difference between crime and deviance, but again, I think it's useful just to think crimes are very clear rules that the breaking of them results in legal sanction or whatever institutional sanction, so here in the academic context, grades. Whereas deviance is much vaguer and more broad. It's just the reaction to either a legal rule breach or something much more informal. So I won't give a million examples, but again, think of yourself in high school or elementary school and a club that you're in or a circle of friends. When someone thinks of someone else as doing something weird or being an outsider, they are probably thinking they are deviating from some expected way of behaving in that group. So if someone comes to your chess club with a checkers board or something like that. So they're deviating. They're like, what are you doing? I can't play with that. Or if they just come in and are like, oh, I forgot how to play this, or this is stupid, then you'll say, oh, that's not what I'm expecting from this transaction. I'm expecting you to be on board with me. Again, if all of you just started talking right away really quickly, it would disrupt the social order of the class, and then I would be forced to penalize the deviants. So again, deviance, just my own personal interest, and in terms of sociology, the sociology of crime and law, so we'll kind of see in the arc. In order to study deviance, you really do have to start with crime. But I'm much more personally interested in deviance, and I think it connects better to every theme that we've addressed in this course, every theory can be extended into deviance. So think of our week on gender, how women's behaviors, and on sexuality, sexual minority, and on race, racial minorities. Think of prejudices that these individuals may experience, or reduced outcomes or lower outcomes in terms of labor opportunities and education. All of these feed into these groups kind of being cast as deviant from some normal, quote-unquote normal expected majority. Again, oftentimes when people feel, in a Durkheimian sense, when they feel anomic, a term we'll discuss at length this class, but when they feel normless, when they feel restless, when they feel depressed, confused, even suicidal at the extreme, these often come from them feeling they just can't get in sync with the norms of their respective groups. Again, sometimes wider society, sometimes networks. So this is at the core of a lot of every sociological topic, really. To what extent do people feel happy with the norms around them? To what extent do they feel norms are oppressing them? To what extent do they feel norms are enabling them to really be themselves? Think of someone with high self-esteem. It likely means they feel the norms around them represent who they are and who they want to be. Again, I think of myself when I was 20 and I was just deciding to go back to school. The norms around, education, having a good job, whatever that means, having, successful friends. At a lot of factors in my life, I felt I was deviant on. And I felt kind of judged and ridiculed. A lot of that was from me, but a lot of it was from people that would ask me, like, why aren't you in school? What are you doing? We all kind of feel that way at different points in our lives about different things. So again, Howard Becker, it's again very broad. Any violation of rules. So in my classes, when I've taught deviant, my major seminar that I've taught 5 times is called Deviant Careers, and I have people look at YouTubers, Avon ladies, truckers, thieves, any sort of career where people are just, where the societal reaction might be, really? That's what you do for a living? So deviance, as it pertains to sociology, again, evokes that sort of reaction in others of kind of, really, or that's what you're doing, or that's odd. So where do our ideas of deviance come from? So we've discussed in previous lectures, in the socialization week, the education week, the gender week, the race week, there are some major institutions that provide us with our norms. So starting from like the bottom with Durkheim and Comte, obviously the laws that are present in a society, the governance structure, those establish basic ideas of what you can and can't do. But as we learned in the weeks I just mentioned, the family, the education system, so teachers, role models, there's a whole set of individuals that sociologists of deviance call moral entrepreneurs. So these are individuals who, in general, influence which morals are kind of meant to be followed in a society. So as we discussed in the history of kind of social life over the last 400 roughly years, so remember societies, we talked last week about religion. In Western society, just as an example, the church and the state were much more connected. Then over time, the influence of religion waned, and then now we're kind of in this knowledge-based technological era. So science replaced religion, industry kind of replaced science, and then now we're back in a presumably scientific age again. And so here, you can think of the moral entrepreneurs at the time as changing, both informally and formally. So again, maybe 500 years ago, roughly, you could think of morals as being defined by religious groups, then being defined by academics and scientists, then by business people, and then now kind of by a whole slew of mixes of different people from those institutions. At a more individual level, you can also think of moral entrepreneurs, again, as being relatives, role models. Just think in your own life, where do my ideas of what being a good person, where do they come from? How much of that is, say, Canadian, or whatever my country of origin is? How much of that is coming from my family? How much of that's coming from my friends? So a little Sociology 3 question you could ask yourself to add to your confusion about things. And you could say, who are the moral entrepreneurs in my life? And why do they have such salience? Remember George Herbert Mead with socialization, and he said, our personalities are the conversation between our kind of active I and all of these me's that we have, right? Remember I said there's the general other, which is like society's voice. So maybe society, your idea of that, is your moral entrepreneur. So again, me, when I was a dropout, I just kind of thought, I'm really just not doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And it wasn't specific people or me's saying that. It was just me kind of seeing other people living in ways not like me. So you could, again, just to think of deviance sociologically, think, where are the morals that I follow, the values that I follow, the beliefs that I follow, where are they coming from, and why am I investing them with the credibility and power that I am? So informal and formal social controls in terms of this is, again, related to the idea that it's not just things that are legal and illegal, so like working being legal and dropping out of school before age 16 being illegal. It's not just that socially controls our behavior or influences our behavior, but again, it's all these informal things like gossip and hearsay and media messages and role models and parents. And just all of these influences that we accumulate over our lives that shape to what extent we feel a behavior is deviant or not. So that's kind of the major introduction to crime and deviance. So now we'll see the trajectory of criminology, which again, some students ask me about test 2 and whether it's cumulative or not. As I've said a few times now, the test is, like, the questions are all directly from things covered after test 1, so starting with social inequality. But as you'll see with the way I'm presenting this, we're building on what we've learned about theory, the kind of history of the discipline, and the methods that are used. So I'm not going to ask you anything specific from the other chapters, because we're already covering a ton of chapters here, but you should be reinforcing what you've learned before. Again, major things, not little things from chapters 1 to 5. Okay, so classical criminology. So now, I like it. Different components of things that I've said would be important in the first kind of quarter of the class. So lectures 1 to 6, roughly. Each subsequent week, a few of those themes resurface. So this week, we'll see the birth of criminology. The origin story of modern criminology began in that kind of tumultuous time period that I said early sociologists were reflecting on. So the nice time span, if you see between Cesar Beccaria and Jeremy Bentham, 1764 and 1838, this was roughly the time of the Western Enlightenment. So science was coming to replace religion as the dominant kind of philosophical approach to life. So people were leaving the quote-unquote romantic views of the world behind, religious views of the world, and embracing new, relatively rudimentary compared to now, but highly sophisticated, empirical, and as we'll see, positivistic principles of science. Remember, this is when Comte was writing, and he said, we are in the positivistic stage. We're really embracing science. We're not fully there because people still have their doubts, and they're still religious and philosophical about things, but we're entering this era. So we'll see the beginning of criminology. So it had that half. So intellectually, there was the dominance of science, but socially, and this is where the big difference between sociology and criminology comes. For sociologists like Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, their central questions were around inequality and social integration. So things that could maybe improve society, but were somewhat abstract. So sociology is often seen as being theoretical. It's often hard for me to explain my work to people. They're like, well, what's the point? You're not really studying, how individuals act or, making policies. You're kind of giving these big theoretical analyses, which I don't think is totally true, but the point is well taken. Because criminologists, so while we had kind of broader social welfare questions in mind, Durkheim talked about suicide, but then his studies were kind of debunked. Criminologists were reflecting on massive increases in actual crime and relatively objective forms of deviance that were taking place in that early Industrial Revolution period where, I told you, people were kind of ripped out of their self-sustained farms and brought into urban cities, or urban areas which are, newly formed cities. So Beccaria and Bentham were two people that started to become part of this very pragmatic school of academics that said, okay, we have a major crime problem. We'll see this later with the term moral panic, which I know the textbook Revel had wrong. I have a slide about that, so don't worry about that. I got a lot of emails about that. But we were living in people were living in a time of a lot of panic over crime, some of which was exacerbated moral panic, and other was quite objectively brutal and scary. So merchant groups being looted, stores and family homes being razed to the ground, spikes in suicide. That's why Durkheim studied that. So again, this was a very chaotic time period. And so modern criminology embraced developments in science to shift explanations away from saying, quote-unquote criminals are people that are possessed or, they're witches and warlocks, demons. They started to try to isolate factors that either may make some people inborn as criminals, a view that we'll see was, of course, later rejected. So people that were inborn as quote-unquote criminals, or B, connecting to sociology, and a lot of people will see are similar, like they're sociologists and criminologists like Robert Merton, who we've discussed before, and even Talcott Parsons. They started to make sociological arguments for the rises of crime. So focusing on the environment, on the way people are raised, socialization, and personal conflicts with norms. So again, this is a time when first attempts are made to study these issues. And so the first kind of consolidated response is called rational choice theory. So here, the idea of people living lives ordained by deities and gods and spirits, this is rejected. And Jeremy Bentham, mostly, comes in and says, you know what? No, we are Enlightenment people. We are enlightened. We're in the wake of the Enlightenment. We're seeing all these geniuses coming up with things. We're becoming cultured and civilized in our view. And people that are engaging in criminal behavior, they know what they're doing. So rational choice theory, rational action theory, it's called different things. It says, okay, people know what they're doing. Maybe they're engaging in criminal behavior because they don't know that what they're doing is actually extremely wrong and will be punished. So here, people are rational. They have free will. They're literally enlightened from a prior view of people as being more kind of pushed around by forces. And if crime is happening, then again, you have two explanations. Either the person is inherently just, immoral and evil, which we'll see soon, was one explanation. Or B, they simply don't know that they're breaking the law. They know what they're doing, but they don't know that it's a violation. So again, you can think of that latter one. If you go on a website, you type in SOCIO03 lectures 2019, which I'm sure you always type. You type that in on Google, and then some scam streaming site opens it, and then you get arrested for pirating sociology videos. And you say, well, I didn't know that's what I was doing. I just typed it. I thought I was on Quercus. And they say, well, it doesn't matter. You know you can't do that. That's the law. So these things come from that. So. Okay, so again, and we're following the trajectory. Again, just think rejection of like spiritual, mystical. Remember animism. So people didn't quite know where criminal tendencies came from, but it was from an external source. Now it's internal. So classical criminology, again, the terms are similar. Classical criminology is often, it's called the classical school. And again, it's important to note too that this school, criminology, was not a discipline at this point. These were mostly politicians, some people that Marx and Marxists would call bourgeois individuals, so wealthy individuals, state people that owned a lot of property, merchant leaders, store owners, all these things. They kind of came together with this school. So, it gets critiqued a lot, but it's called the classical school, and it's, again, we have free will, and we believe these 4 things about the nature of crime and how to solve it. So number 1, people have free will. And this leads to them either choosing criminal or lawful solutions. So anyone that's choosing anything, they've thought about it. Number 2, criminal solutions are seen as more attractive than lawful ones on average if they require less work. So crime as the path of least resistance. Premise number 3, the fear of punishment can control people's choices. So again, think. If I'm deciding to do a crime or not, it's demonstrating that I'm rationally weighing pros and cons. If it seems like I can really get away with the crime, or the risk of punishment, or the cost of punishment is low, I might choose it. So in order to make me not choose it as a rational person, crime punishment, I should know that it's punishable, and I should know that it's severe. And then lastly, a society is better able to control crime, so putting it all together, when there's measured severity, so do the crime, get the time, so when there's a relative balance of crime. So this is why different countries and states differ, for example, in terms of giving the death penalty. Some states, it's, life for a life, eye for an eye. In others, it's more, life sentences or things with parole, so people vary over whether that matches. Certainty of punishment, so that's extremely important in every society, so that's okay, we have a law on the books and we have to make sure this is actually implemented. We can see where that gets difficult with things like sexual assault, where oftentimes charges are made, but they're difficult to prove due to the sexual assault often being to be stereotypical, he said, she said type of thing, and forensic evidence and things like that have been helping that, but sexual assault is still an area where it's quite difficult to make sure that punishment is certain due to the cases often being left cold. And then lastly, swiftness of justice. So for anyone with pets, one thing they always say when you train a pet is if it violates one of your norms, punish it right away, very gently. And if you wait too long, then they won't build up that association. So again, rational classical schools the classical school starts with the idea that we've embraced the Enlightenment. It's not about people necessarily being born criminals or possessed by something, but they've chosen to do crime either because they think they can get away with it, or that it's not that serious, or even that it's not a crime. And again, think today about things like pirating, jaywalking, even plagiarism. These are things where, maybe people do them because they think, I'll probably just get a slap on the wrist if I get caught, or, it's not really that bad, it's justifiable. So versus something like murder, or, robbing a bank. So just as in sociology, though, it's never as simple as saying, okay, this one time period, everyone was on the same page, they just embraced Enlightenment values. And they thought everyone was rational. What do you think might be, and imagine you're always try to give people the benefit of the doubt, because we're going to see that biological determinism is indeed awful and becomes racist and sexist and all these things. But imagine if you were told that everyone that commits crime is totally rational about what they're doing. What thought might come to your mind? If you're trying to plan society and reduce crime rates, what might a criticism of that be? So people just aren't rational. So does anyone want to expand on that? So what are we assuming about people? Remember we talk about structure and agency. What are we assuming if we say everyone is totally responsible for their actions, and if they commit a crime, clearly they've thought about it and they've chosen to do it, and so, throw the book at them. Come on, just give me your natural thoughts. Sorry? Benefits, okay. Where? Yep.
I mean, like you said, structure versus agency. So, like, if the structure around them, the environment around them, doesn't allow them to fulfill the needs, then the rational choice of action might prefer them to commit the crime, I suppose. Steal.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Because it's something that we're assuming that everyone has total agency, how they work,
Right, so overall great comments. The major role, so benefits, they're all linked. So the external pressures a person faces. So we'll see with the biological perspective, who they focused on mostly were members of, the quote-unquote lower classes. But what they did was they looked at, who was most likely to commit crime, and, they went the wrong way with it. But they looked at, okay, they said men are more likely to commit crime than women. They looked at racial minorities. They said they were more likely to. They weren't. But they basically, what this school reacted to, and people suffering from mental illness. So they looked at individuals who had impairments in their mind on rational thinking. And so as we'll see, when taken to the biological level, this becomes very problematic. But this school provided the foundation for sociologists to then say, okay, you know what, you're right. Everyone isn't, it's not all about rationality. People don't have, level 100 agency. They make the choices for other reasons. So what started out in positivism with biological explanations then became structural explanations for sociologists. So we'll see things like Robert Merton saying, it's not a person's cranium size or whatever, so the image of the criminal man. I looked at this photo and I'm like, is that me? It's kind of, it's somewhat similar, right? Well, there's one big difference. So the concave profile, I have a hump on my nose, so that's not me. But so, anyway, so the idea with, before we get to the sociological reaction, again, think of people back then. They were thinking, okay, we've amped up this idea of rational behavior, but I know a lot of people that act according to their emotions. And so, where does that fit? So they turned to horrible things in biological determinism. So they were saying, like in that photo, you can see criminal man based on, jaw shape, brain size, hand features, the profile shapes, all of these things. But you'll see that then, roughly 50, 100 years later, people said, okay, once they did more studies and they found out that there was not any biological correlation, they did start to say things like, yes, men are committing crime more often, but that may be due to strain that men experience. So, if society is telling men they're the primary breadwinner and that they should be, man of the house and all of this, and also that they're supposed to be protecting the women and children in their families, and they're supposed to be stoic and in control of their lives, if they can't earn a lot of money, they may turn to crime. Also, norms about men being more aggressive then make it more likely for men to maybe think, hey, I'm going to show my masculinity, I'm going to show my economic prowess by stealing. So, again, in positive, this school was largely a reaction to people, again, upping the agency level and saying, maybe people aren't totally in control of themselves all the time, it's something else. But, they turned to the idea of people saying people are born criminal, whereas then future criminologists and sociologists said, well, maybe they're born into areas and into social milieus with criminogenic norms and values and beliefs, and they enter situations that make them think crime is rational. So you kind of, again, you have two spectrums, right? You have the classical school where it's pure agency, the positivist school where it's pure, into internal biological structure, And then contemporary sociologists, which I kind of have said throughout the course, always try to blend the two of those. And we're in a very interesting time now, speaking of the dominance of science again. There is a school of criminology and sociology, again, that I'm kind of a part of, which is called biosocial criminology and sociology. And here, rather than say, you know, certain people are born criminal or not, sociologists, criminologists, psychologists, biologists look for, you know, genes and genetic effects. So things like latent genes that may get triggered in certain environments, you know, the impact of early childhood trauma on shaping people's aggressive tendencies or the way that they, you know, handle things like social anxiety. So the biological component's coming back, but in a social sense. So again, this school is often kind of thrown away due to the bad things that it did, which were extremely heinous, leading to what was called social Darwinism. So again, genocides, you know, you can see the connection to even like Nazi principles. And so absolutely awful, but there has been a return to seeing, you know, to what extent does our biochemistry influence our different aspects of our life, and how has that changed over the life course? Again, that's something I was interested in just because I was always trying to find the part of me that was addicted to video games. And then I realized it's not that simple, right? The whole thing of the self and the identity. I'd love to just find my little gamer chromosome and zap it. And amplify my professor chromosome, or gene or whatever, but it's not that simple, unfortunately. Okay, so before the break, study buddy question number 1. Compare and contrast rational choice theory to, in this course I'll be using positivist, and biological kind of under the same thing, because it's part of one movement. So compare rational choice and positivistic approaches to crime and deviance. I've said a lot of my thing, but I want you to think, again, your own opinions on, you know, think of it in terms of structure and agency, if that's helpful. Think of it in terms of, you know, again, even inequality. You know, this positivistic ways are a way of saying, you know, the people that are doing crime are different from us and they're inferior. There's a lot of parallels with the racialization week. You know, so again, it works on multiple sides. So why might some people favor one approach over the other? And how do both approaches impact the relationship between crime, deviance, and morality? So just talk with your study buddies for a few minutes, and then I will take up the fruits of your conversations, and then we'll have a 10-minute break. So again, yep.
I think that the rational choice theory, since it puts a lot of like the responsibility on like the individual who's committed crime, I think it's good for is good for people that want to just put the blame on individual people and say that they knew what they were doing and they're just inherently bad and they chose to because they wanted to. And although like I know the biological approach is like flawed because of saying that someone's traits are inferior or criminal, but at the same time by looking at other factors besides just the individual person and like acknowledging that there's other forces involved in influencing someone's decision, I think that that approach is a little better for how to explain why they've done something.
Yeah, so great observation. So again, the rational choice theory, it depends also on the kind of crime you're talking about. So let's say I'm thinking of myself. So when I was told I needed to enlist some sort of plagiarism penalty, I came up with the academic integrity penalty scheme, and I tried to, I used implicitly rational choice theory for that. I said, okay, I'm going to make the guidelines clear. I'm going to talk about them several times, and it'll be transparent. Students will know, and then I'll tell my TAs and what the academic advisors told me. They said, okay, if students violate this, you've already said it, you have resources for them, then the ball's in their court. So I individualized it, and if people didn't read it or whatever, it's like, because again, it's one of those unfortunate rules that I had to make. So rational choice theory is often used in that way when it's like, okay, I told you the rules, you chose to violate it. Maybe you didn't choose, maybe you forgot, maybe you didn't know, but I have to treat it that way out of fairness. On the other hand, positivistic approaches might say, maybe those rules aren't very fair because what if a student started the course late? What if they're very overwhelmed? What if they just forgot? What if they were totally honest in every other way, but then they just didn't do that? A biological approach would be not good, like a strong biological approach saying, some students just aren't capable of following the rules. That wouldn't be very good. But by focusing on external factors, saying, maybe students that are much more stressed out or have other life problems going on, maybe they'll be less likely to follow the rules, and you'll be over-punishing people by thinking they're choosing this when really they're not. So it very much depends, I think, like anything. So any theory, remember rule number 1 about theory in Sociology A03, is that the choice of theory that you use should be guided by your research question, right? And so criminology is different because it's not so much about, nowadays it's a bit different, but when it originally formed, it wasn't so much about research questions, but of actually impacting crime rates. So if there was a kind of crime that went on, and I do think plagiarism is a good case of that. Oftentimes people plagiarize just because they don't know what plagiarism is. It's not, most people don't have some big burning desire to, not cite or something. They just don't know the proper way of doing it. So that fits that theory pretty well. Whereas if you're looking at, as we'll see with Merton and other contemporary sociologists, Claird and Olin, if you look at other topics, so things like joining gangs, things like committing different sorts of violent robberies, assaults, and thefts and things like that, you do need to look at other factors other than just a person having information about the pros and cons of the crime. There are things that push people to do it. And again, I just finished watching which I highly recommend, the Netflix little 4-episode series on Ted Bundy. I don't know if any of you know about that. Really good, yeah. So it's really good. And again, you think, oh my gosh, he did this. He killed 36 people, and he was representing himself in court and all of this. And clearly you would think rational choice theory does not apply to someone like that. There's something going on in him. And that's what makes serial killers so fascinating for academics and just the public alike, why people like shows like that, because it's in the mind of a serial killer and all of that. So again, the biological perspective could be more, was it the way he was raised? They went into his family. He had a great family. It didn't really make sense. It's one of those cases that disturbs people on many levels. Okay, so we'll take a 10-minute break, and then when we get back, we will move into more contemporary explanations. And then, as usual, the new trend, for those of you that stick around until 4 p.m., you will get the preview of the new study video. And this one is a different format again, so I'm excited to release that to all of you. So now the twain shall meet. So we've discussed criminology. Again, the distinction between sociology and criminology is not particularly important for this class. But as I've discussed it, criminology is both a field in its own right. Much like I was talking to a student in the break, just like public policy can be its own field. But of course, as we've learned over the year, sociologists are very interested in crime and deviance, just as they're interested in policies, as we've seen throughout. So again, sociology is kind of the umbrella social science. Anything involving social behavior is part of it. So this idea of being focused on social behaviors, again, we've talked about nature versus nurture and other things more in the socialization week, and family versus like larger institutions and shaping what we think and all of that. The sociological shift in criminology, so you could kind of think of the classical school and the positive school or biological school. Again, classical school and rational choice school theory, they're the same thing. and then positivist and biological are the same thing. You could kind of think of both of those as being pre-sociological. Because again, this is where the thinking in terms of timelines is helpful. Remember, rational choice and biological were being developed in the 1700s and 1800s, and that's right when Comte and Marx and Weber were writing, and then like the rules of sociological method came out in like 1892 or something. So sociology was just forming through Emile Durkheim. So this was a time when a bunch of different people were thinking about similar topics, but sociology proper was not formed yet. Again, it was named in the 1700s by Comte in 1800s, but it didn't influence everything yet. So the shift in sociology takes place predominantly in the 20th century, but the first book that marks a sociological shift in the study of crime is Emile Durkheim's most famous book, Suicide. And here he makes his famous argument of saying, deviance is normal. So remember, Durkheim talks about the state of anomy, normlessness. So remember, he was very critical of the rational school. So we didn't talk about it framed that way. But remember, he was very, very critical of the French Revolution. Not as a whole, but he said, okay, it's one thing to say we're enlightened and that religion is of the past and we're embracing science and free will and all of this, but people follow norms and they become habituated to their environments. So if you tell people that their whole way of life is like stupid or doesn't make sense, and you put them in a new environment, they're going to have a sort of like value lag. They might find themselves, awkwardly between two worlds. Their old way of life that provided them identity, stability, has now been taken away from them. This was one of the central problems of the Industrial Revolution, of ripping people out of their farm homes and putting them in cities and then saying, oh, it's great because now you can work for yourself. But, what if you liked your previous way of life? So Durkheim and functionalists, again, they said, we need to be very careful when we talk about agency and free will and rationalism and all of this, because people are very norm and habit driven. And more grounded in that is that a lot of people's decisions are influenced by outside factors, things they can't control, by social facts. So the first sociological proper, and by sociological proper I just mean like formal sociological approach, was grounded in Durkheim's notion of anomy. So remember, he said suicide was the most extreme, but unfortunately common response to people feeling normless. And this sense of normlessness leads to deviant behavior, including the explicit violation of legal rules and norms. So in Durkheim's mind, you could see naturally and statistically in terms of population aggregates, you could see that something like the French Revolution may lead to a spike in crime. So imagine a population largely following religious values. A group of people, the bourgeoisie at the time, they fight with the political leaders and they say, no, we're being oppressed. Boom, war. Now, for many of the people that didn't really necessarily feel oppressed or realize they were oppressed or had their kind of lifestyles, these were radically altered. The nature of work changed, the nature of intellectualism changed, and for many of those people, they may have felt this sort of normative conflict of, whoa, my world changed, I don't really know what to do. And so this could lead to normative breaches, so you just not following the rules, or it could lead to you, trying to defy those rules due to a variety of reasons. So we'll see in functionalism the reasons for rule violations are relatively vague. So anomy gets explicitly built upon by Robert Merton in the 20th century, but functionalists were really the first ones to say, okay, crime is normal. So crime is statistically normal. Deviance is normal. It's a response to normative chaos and confusion. So again, this is why functionalists are often called conservative, both politically and socially, in that they're, it's not that they don't want change, they're just always thinking about those latent consequences. Maybe if there's a social change, a group of people really might not like it. So we have to be careful about that. So Durkheim's anomy is seen most clearly in the work of, and made most famous in the work of Robert Merton, who's someone we've discussed. He was very different in his approach, but he was writing in the same time period roughly as C. Wright Mills, so around 1940. And his famous work is called Social Structure and Anomy. And essentially, he looks at how American life prompts people to feel anomic due to a discrepancy between cultural goals on the one hand. So again, just think of like a stereotype of America, everyone wants the American dream. Have a family, get a nice car, have success, some version of that. So a cultural goal that's universally shared, the American dream, within America presumably. And then, there's one thing to have a goal and a value, but people differ in terms of the means and the opportunities that they have to actually realize those goals. So Robert Merton says crime and deviance is a result of a discrepancy between cultural values and goals on the one hand, and then the actual opportunity structures to realize those goals and means. So to Merton, that's why you don't see as much crime among the very wealthy, like things like street crime and theft, or among the highly educated, or people that are like legacy, Ivy League university students. You won't see that because for them, well, they can realize the American dream by, going to nice schools, having lots of extracurriculars and peer networks, being linked in to others in terms of the labor market. Whereas someone in a disenfranchised neighborhood, growing up in a lone parent home with lots of siblings, maybe on welfare, for them, it's not that they can't do that, but they don't have the physical opportunities, or the opportunities may be much more taxing for them to take. So their school may be of lesser quality, a higher student-teacher ratio. Their role models around them may not be as educated, or they may actually be anti the education system, or quote-unquote the man. So those opportunity structures for Merton were the key things that prompt some people to find themselves anomic, whereas other people don't. So as I said, this could still sound abstract, but what Merton did was, and why this is probably one of the top 5 sociology articles, again, he said, you can see really where people fit with this. So it's very social psychological, really. Again, it's written at that time, the early 40s, I believe, the 40s anyway. It's written in the 40s, which was this time when people started to become, they were blending macro and micro approaches and really thinking about how social structures shaped our thoughts and personalities. So Merton developed 5 reactions to what he called an anomic society. So again, you can think of this in contemporary Canada as well. Think a cultural goal is, have a meaningful, successful career. And then what makes that anomic is that, by definition, not everyone can have their own kind of perfect ideal career. There are tons of jobs that don't pay well. There are things like credentialism. There's many factors that prevent that. So this would be an anomic society in Merton's terms, because we are elevating goals that not everyone can reach. So the same as how, whatever society's norms are about, attractive individuals, successful individuals. By definition, someone is attractive or successful because they're more attractive or more successful than someone else. So a lot of our goals are hierarchical. So that means a lot of people are going to feel strain. So the 5 reactions, so again, he did statistical analyses, and he came out of the Chicago school where people, he was related to that, where people were doing ethnographies, participant observation, interviews, and he came up with these 5 categories of how people respond to ANOMIC. Again, this is ANOMIC at the societal level. So how does a person respond to a structure? Remember, it was social structure and ANOMIC. Durkheim was more focused on how people feel anomic. For him, he's adding this mediating level. So reaction number 1 is conformity. So conformity is the most common. So this means you can be living in a society, again, think of America in his time, be rich, be fabulous, be attractive, whatever. That's the goals. Most people will internalize those, and they will say, okay, I'm going to go to school or get an apprenticeship, I'm going to get a good job, I want a, family and kids, white picket fence house, live in the suburbs. Things change over time, now it's, I want to be an Instagram influencer and globetrotter / FMLer or whatever the hell. And, I want to be lit as F and stuff. So whatever it is, the conforming to whatever the trend is, that's what most people do. And again, you can think of what theory, why theories within theories, why do you think most people accept the norms of society? I mean, that's a debate. Are we duped into doing it? Do we want to do it? But that's the bulk of people, right? We're all, by virtue of being in higher education, we're conforming to part of society's dreams about us, of saying, education's valuable, maybe you don't totally agree with it, you think part of it's bogus, but you're still doing it. So that's the most common response to most disjunctures. And then innovation is the opposite. So, well, not full opposite. The full opposite's retreatism. But so conformity, importantly, so think goals and means. Again, means are opportunities. So I want to be rich is a goal. Means of doing so that are legitimate are getting a great career, winning a lottery, or doing now crowdsourcing from people, GoFundMe and stuff. You could get rich that way. So those are legitimate means. So conformists do legitimate goals, legitimate means. Now, innovators, they accept the goals. So I want to be rich. I want to be an influencer. But they do it through illegitimate means. So that is the typical quote-unquote criminal or offender. So I want to be rich, but I don't have the opportunity to do so. Or I want to get rich right now. So I'm going to steal a car. I'm going to rob a bank. I'm going to rob someone. I'm going to develop a Ponzi scheme. I'm going to be an embezzler. I want to build my YouTube influencer status, so I'm going to buy subscribers and comments and likes. Which I actually thought about doing because I was teaching this week. But then I thought, you know what, actually, the thing that's, I'm quite devious about that stuff. The reason I didn't was because I'm like, well, if I get caught doing that, then it's like just no one will ever take me seriously again. But, anyway, so subscribe to my channel so that I don't have to do that. Because for now, I'm not innovating, but I'm not, the thought is there. So again, here, the innovator, the reason why it's innovating, think about it, they're finding new means to meet a goal. So again, think of yourself as students and myself as one. If I'm not getting the grade I want, maybe in my mind, I might think to hire an essay writer, right? That's just something people think. Obviously, don't do that. But the thought, it's totally understandable if you think of that. Or I'll have my friend who in an upper year look at it. Or, you could do legitimate innovation, which would then, if you were a conformist, or more of a conformist typology, if you're not doing well, we say talk to the professor, talk to the TA. That's totally fine. If you don't talk to us and then it builds up, you may do Merton's. You may start to feel anomic strain and then innovate by hiring essay writers. And then get charged with plagiarism, and then that's the end of your university. So don't go that route. Ritual, so innovator, again, that's the quote-unquote criminal offender. And again, I'm saying quote unquote to mark the shift in sociology away from looking at people as kind of criminals and non-criminals to then seeing people's behaviors as being either criminal or non-criminal based on kind of the context they find themselves in. So ritualism, this is the kind of, this is the one that you could make the most memes about. So the ritualist is the person who has given up on the goal, but they continue with the means anyway. So that's all of us at a job or at school or sometimes, hopefully not very often, but in a relationship where they say, I was doing this because I was passionate about it, or I really wanted to become a doctor or whatever. Now I'm just doing it because I'm doing it. So ritual, you're doing it out of routine. So it comes out of the idea of a lot of, again, reflecting on America, a lot of Catholics and Protestants going to church and attending services ritualistically. They don't really think about the goal so much. Maybe they've given up their faith. Faith goes up and down over the life course, but they're just doing it. So here, I think it's BS that like some people are rich or I don't have the money, and this job's soul-sucking, but I'm just going to do it anyway. I'm not going to turn to crime because I'm not quite upset enough to do that. Or I still have the opportunities to make an okay amount of money. Retreatism is the most uncommon and the most severe. So retreatism is the one that would lead people to things like substance abuse and suicide and self-harm. So this is when you're at rock bottom in your life, which again, hopefully, it does not happen very often or at all for any of you, if it hasn't already. So this is when you give up on both the goals and means. So in terms of Merton and the American dream, this would be when you say, you know what, I don't really care about being rich or successful, and I don't really care about having a job or a family or any of the means of getting that goal. So you may then, in a positivistic sense or rational choice sense, depending on your perspective, you may say, I'm just going to live for now, I'm going to go backpacking around the world, or I'm going to use drugs, or I'm going to play video games or watch movies all day. Whatever it is, you're rejecting normal life completely. And you'll see it's kind of blurred with the last one, so rebellion, more common than retreatism. The central thing, it would be the emotional valence of this. Retreatists are more depressed, typically, so they would be the standard anomic subject of Durkheim. Remember, he's talking about people committing suicide. That would be people retreating from society, but you would also have rebels. So a rebel is someone, screw this, I'm going to do something different. So ultimately, it results in the same sort of process of you're doing something different and you've given up on the goals, but it's about the emotion that you have. Are you frustrated and you want to change things and do something different completely? Or are you kind of withdrawing? So a rebel here would be, again, you could think of a serial murderer or serial killer. They're rebelling. They're like angry about what they're doing, and they're going to insert themselves in society. And again, these are, you can say, well, aren't serial killers kind of conforming because, or innovating because they it's common that a lot of killers, psychologists say that they have narcissistic qualities and they kind of want to be infamous. Yes, these things can blend, but these are categories just to capture the 5 most common reactions to living, again, in a society where, you're told you should be doing one thing, but you find that many people, it's harder for them to do that. So Cloward and Olin, again, extend this. So it's not a big detour from this. It's just this became a kind of strain theory, which is what the Merton's types of enemies under strain theory, which again is a more specified Durkheimian functionalist perspective. It kind of combines functionalism and conflict theory with a bit of symbolic interactionism because, it says, well, deviance is a product of people adapting to a society that is conflict-ridden, right? Like it's unequal. Some people can meet the goals, some people can't. Some can more easily, it's more challenging. So strain theory's permanence, people still use it to analyze crime, is that it really blends kind of the 3 best aspects of the the classical, the three classical schools. Again, it sees deviance as a normal response for certain people, depending on their life context. It sees it as grounded in inequality, in that people with a lot of means won't turn, they won't innovate because they won't have to. And then there's this thought process going on, like a symbolic interactionist of saying, you know, there's frustration, there's emotion, there's happiness. So it's really a great theory. It's, Merton developed what he called middle range theories, ones that could be applied to specific cases. And so, again, this has been enduring in that it just kind of, you know, intuitively makes sense. So Cloward and Olin extended this to say, you know, it really is about those opportunities. So this is a more symbolic interactionist approach and you'll see things like Sutherland and Cressy, where the quote of what criminology is, where that comes from. It's called differential association theory, and they start to say, okay, part of the reason why people vary in these types of anomie is based on what they learn growing up, how they're socialized. Again, people with more criminal role models, it's not just that they're, you know, copying them automatically or something, or people born into criminal families, like mafia families or something. It's not that they're biologically criminals, but the symbols around them, the cultural ideals at a local level, those are criminogenic. And so through differential association, meaning the extent to which people are differently associate with cultural goals. So if I grew up in a mafia home, I'm going to be associating with like mafia things, whereas if you grow up in a presidential home, then you're going to be seeing like things about the White House and whatever. The extent to which people differently associate with common values leads them towards crime and deviance and all sorts of things. So again, these theories, as much as they differ, the central kind of breaking off point is when the role of the environment becomes key. So again, as I said, all of these, everything in this course is cumulative. Crime is one other domain to which we can see, you know, to what extent is this a big functionalist argument? To what extent is it about inequality? To what extent is it a kind of personal identity thing? And why I've been so fascinated by crime and deviance is that it really kind of forces you, I think anyway, to look at all three kind of major schools at the same time. Again, in my own research, the thing that got me started with that was video game addiction. And I said, you know, about myself and my friends, I'm like, yeah, you know, most of me and my friends, we all had single mother homes. We lived, you know, not a privileged neighborhood or whatever. I was trying to find causes. Were we adapting? There's a bit of conflict theory in there. But then I knew, I was like, well, I actively chose this. Like, this was meaningful to me. It wasn't like I wasn't pushed into this. There's something in me and my friends. Again, I think with crime, it is because of how inherently emotional and physical and bodily it is. It kind of forces people to really move from the abstract and say, okay, we want to reduce crime. We really have to come up with theories for why the heck it is that people do, you know, heinous things. Again, not that other topics aren't important as well, but this one I think has that public dimension. I mean, people are so, you know, when you watch those killer documentaries and people wanting justice, it's just, it's so visceral that I think it makes it much more practical than some of the other fields. Okay, so study buddy question 2. So again, just to ground this, so you flush it out again, not just for this course, but you'll see those, the Merton's adaptations to anomic conditions is something that you will certainly come into encounter with again. So I want you to try to apply it to experiences you've had or other people. So study buddy question 2, have you or anyone that you know engaged in one of Merton's 5 types of adaptation to anomic conditions? And if so, did having illegitimate opportunities available influence this process? So again, an illegitimate opportunity would be, you know, was there did you have a connection if you were, thinking of using drugs, or did you, were you part of a gang? You don't have to out yourself or whatever, but did you know someone that had, that could make it easy for you? Because, part of why there's a social class differential in crime is that someone raised in, a stereotypical white picket fence neighborhood, they just don't have access to criminal networks. Not that people in lower class neighborhoods have access to that. I mean, in my neighborhood in North York, I knew kind of where those people hung out, but I wasn't part of that subculture at all. So it's, think of a case, either yourself, a friend, someone you know, someone in the media, and which of the five adaptations did they make, and did their opportunity structure that, or do you think it was something else? So just discuss. Again, we want to see your two things here. You're thinking about kind of how sociologists look at crime and how structures and opportunities shape how people react to things. Say anything because they don't want to out their deviance, but yeah.
Okay, if you want to go fishing past January 1st, this year, and because that's when your license expired, but you know it's expired, but you still go to do it because you just think it's fun and no one's going to check. Could that be innovation? If you still have it, it's expired. Would that be?
So innovation would be coming up with there's a goal you want, and then you're turning to crime to do that. So that would more just be ignoring the rule and hoping you don't get caught. Yep.
When it comes, I think it's under the Mental Health Act that someone can be arrested if they have shown kind of a tendency to do that. So I guess in that term, it's going against what is generally known in the society.
So which adaptation did you think that was again? Retreatism, yep, exactly. So, so suicide is an example of retreatism. You've given up on, you know that it's something that's tabooed by every religion, depending on the motive you're doing it for, and by society's rules, and you do it anyway because you are feeling, you've given up on all societal goals and all means for achieving them. And again, for me, it's funny and it's not. I mean, I frame my personal kind of trajectory as, I was to give myself more agency, I guess. I talk about how I was trying to be a pro gamer, but gaming for me, part of why I always studied it again. The theories you use come out of your research question. Retreatism was a huge reason for why I personally dropped out of school and played video games. And it was me then only once I started realizing, hey, I'm actually good at something and I can make friends and all of that, then I started to think, okay, maybe I can kind of not retreat from society and put my time in something more productive. And again, I'm not saying gaming's not productive, but we all have our histories with things. For me, it's kind of tied up with a moment in my life where, I wasn't feeling my best. So that's why. Subsequently I stopped researching that because I'm that's the past. I'm now going to have new problems. But that one, we all have our reasons for doing things. So again, it's interesting. I just think, sociology is so personal, and that's what drew me to it. I originally was just interested in understanding, I said, well, I'm glad I turned to video games and not drugs or something at that age. Again, a lot of people can manage drugs, but the whole issue is if you are retreating, that's when things become scary at a personal level. Things like problematic use and addiction often kind of spiral out from people when they start to do something, and then the way they weigh the pros and cons of their lives start to get altered. So again, studying sociology, I think it's important because you can see, to what extent is a person's behavior really under their control? If they've started in a cycle of behavior and then that becomes a new habit, and if you see certain members of the population are more likely to do things like that, as a sociologist, you start to say, well, how can we kind of make life easier for people so certain people won't turn to those things as options? Again, that's, I think, the benefit of starting from the outside. which we see in criminology too, kind of shifting from rational choice and biology to then external factors. Of course, you don't want to go all the way in the other side. Again, structure and agency. I don't want to paint my life history of saying, because of my, life and stuff, I was pushed into playing video games, because I wasn't. I mean, I chose that. But, anyway, so these are, if you want to be perpetually confused, these theories will help you. Everything they clarify, they then make something else unsettled. Okay, so functionalism. So now, again, Merton, as I've said, really links together all of the approaches. So, I thought about the order of how to put them. He is typically seen as functionalist, but it's not very accurate. I mean, people often pit Merton against C. Wright Mills, but he was highly critical of the American dream and inequality, so I don't really think it makes a ton of sense for it to frame him that way. But that said, he was focused on kind of societal level norms and the extent to which people adapt to the norms within the societal organism, if you will. Conflict theorists are much more focused on the role of the state and the role of the elites in creating environments that foster crime for certain members of the population. This is essentially a more critical version of strain theory. So strain theory would say, okay, how can we recalibrate norms and opportunity structures? Again, we'll say, oh, for some people, they have all the means to reach the goals. And for other people, like born in extreme poverty or in abusive homes, they have very few means to meet those goals. Conflict theorists then say, okay, rather than trying to recalibrate these, let's critique these and see how they're reinforcing inequalities. So again, it all depends on what your aim is in the work that you're doing. So again, here this is that it goes even one step further. So the very laws we have in society, they're not neutral. They come from the attempt to privilege or marginalize certain groups. An example of this is the vagrancy laws that I talked about in early Britain that emerged in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. Remember, vagrancy laws obviously only targeted the newly poor urban class. So it was men that were, women would have been too, but they were just much less likely to become vagrants due to having children and needing to have a house for the kids. But men have children too, but then they would leave them with the women. So these were laws that were directly targeted at poor men, but on paper fit kind of any adult. So they were targeting these men that weren't working in factories. They were not targeting wealthy men because, again, a wealthy man it's very unlikely that he would decide to become a kind of homeless person randomly. So these were people that were rejecting new rules and new norms and kind of building their own communes and farms. And these laws said, no, if you do not work for an employer or you do not have, a certain kind of estate, you are a criminal and you'll be arrested. You can also think of laws that kind of define certain things as deviant or crime. If you think of the American past again and think of kind of post-slavery America, so things like Jim Crow and laws that made certain actions illegal for African Americans but not for white Americans. So entering certain spaces, going in white-only washrooms. Those are prime examples of creating a conflict-based or hierarchical criminogenic environment. So it makes more sense then that African Americans would be more likely to be arrested when there are more laws prohibiting their behaviors than white individuals. And that's a huge issue now. Again, I won't get into all the details of that in this class, just because there's so much to talk about. But again, my kind of core class was policing and the history of the police in Britain, America, Canada, again, just focusing on the West, just due to being in Canada. But common among all of those countries, again, was the creation of laws that kind of de facto created more criminal opportunities for certain individuals than for others. Again, not even that those individuals would do more crime, but the actions they were doing were designated as crime. So again, conflict theory, it depends on what your on what your focus is. So if you're focused on racial inequalities in policing, so things like Black Lives Matter, it makes more sense for you to take a conflict approach and say, how is it that Black Canadians are so overrepresented in the criminal justice system, or Indigenous individuals? You might be drawn more to conflict theory to then understand that. Who's privileging from this, who's continually being kind of left behind. So symbolic interactionism, again, kind of the final one, there's feminist theory and post-structuralism apply as well, but again, just for sake of time, I'll just mention feminist theory briefly after. But symbolic interactionism, as I said, is focused on the process. So again, strain theory implies all of this, but it's more of a structural argument, and so is conflict theory. Again, conflict theory is not super focused on, the processes by which African Americans are put in situations that are deemed criminal or whatever the focus is. They're more focused in the big structural argument, the historical argument. Symbolic interactionists would say, okay, let's bracket that history for a bit and then see how is it that some people come to engage in deviant behavior. So Sutherland, as I said, in differential association, I won't go too much over that because I explained it before. He says the intensity, frequency, and duration of the interactions with others shape the extent to which they engage in either law-abiding or law-breaking behavior. So think of intensity. So again, if I'm born in a mafia or gang family, the intensity of my relationship with law-breaking others is going to be strong, right? Because it's my parents or it's my siblings or like people I love and trust. Versus, that's why I said you could live in a neighborhood, like many people do, where there are gangs or something, and that doesn't mean you're necessarily going to become a gang member because you may not be associating with them. You might see them around, you may even hate them. But if they're part of your family or you're connected to them, they're your friends, the intensity is high. And that makes it more likely, again, as per the socialization and gender and education weeks, that you'll kind of, you'll agree with what they're teaching you. And they'll be more likely to actually teach with you rather than just like see you on the street or something. And then frequency again, your parents could be gang members, but maybe you never see them, and instead you're spending all of your time at school. So it could be intense when you see them, but maybe it doesn't leave an impact on you because you only see them once a week. And then lastly, again, the duration of interactions. So these are all practical. So the duration of interactions, again, is, okay, if I see them every day, are these meaningful interactions? Are they actually like I'm having dinner with them or breakfast and talking, or am I just seeing them or talking to them for a second? So again, this is very much building on the socialization week. The extent to which you socialize with people that disobey or obey the law influences the extent to which you'll disobey or obey. So again, think of, it doesn't even have to be crime, but think of why you're not deviating from the norm of going to higher education. Was it, conversations with parents, conversations with peers, people in your neighborhood? Were there people in your life that told you, school's the thing to do, if you don't do it, things might not be so great for you? Again, if you were not exposed to people like that, again, myself, if I was not exposed to people that were telling me, what are you doing? Why aren't you in school? Again, that wasn't strong enough for me when I was younger. People were telling me that, but I still retreated and dropped out. But then as I got older, I did start to, those started to impact me more. Again, there's no magic formula for how someone becomes associated. We all know how our values and beliefs change. But the idea of differential association theory was, on average, looking at the population, you could say someone is more likely to deviate or enter into crime if they have a lot of those associations with, if they associate more with rule breakers than with rule conformers or rule followers. Which I think, there's problems with that, but it's a start to thinking about how people make these decisions. So linked to differential association theory, the final theory we'll discuss this week, is labeling theory. So this, so if differential association theory is more about kind of the self and knowledge and who you think you are and what you want to follow, labeling theory is more about, so that's more about, the self and George Herbert Mead. Labeling theory is inspired more by Charles Horton Cooley and Du Bois in terms of the double consciousness. So here, remember, the looking glass self is the idea that you internalize kind of how other people frame you. So if you are continually told that you're deviant, so if someone says, again, let's think of higher education. If someone says you're stupid all the time, if you're called stupid by your parents, if people in your neighborhood say, oh, someone like you can't go to university, over time, you may say, well, I've been told I'm not going to be successful. I've been told I'm not going to do well in school. I'm labeled as someone that's not good at this. I'm not going to opt into this. I'm going to deviate. I could retreat. I could rebel. I could become ritualistic. I could say, you know what, I know whatever, people don't like me, but I'm just doing this anyway. So differential association theory and labeling theory, again, are focused more on the process by which someone comes to conform on the one hand or rebel on the other hand. It asks, to what extent do people associate with others that make them think violating or following rules is good? And then to what extent do the reactions of others, remember, deviance is all about how people in society react to norm violations. This is, again, that self-reflexive part where you say to yourself, how do others see me? And, is deviating the thing to do? Again, if you decide, say, not to drop out of university or like to quit your job or not to quit your job, you may be thinking of your parents or your partner or someone. You'd think of someone who would react to that deviation, right? So again, it's more likely for people that don't have those sorts of strong networks to deviate, because if they think no one's reacting, then they don't care as much. So that's why the Bell Mental Health Awareness Month and all of that, they always say, when someone expresses attitudes about suicide or self-harm, it's very important to make it known that you are someone that cares about them. Because oftentimes, again, people will react when no one is reacting to them. So just for sake of time, so this is, I knew, I got the timing down now. I know that it's, usually we only have time for 2 study buddy questions. So this one's just to think about. So we already did one, and I liked your responses. So just think about this going forward again. Compare and contrast, so both the kind of pre-sociological theories, so rational choice and biological, to the sociological approaches. You'll likely, because you're in a sociology class, you'll likely find and just the way I presented them, you'll likely find the sociological ones more compelling. But think, what is it that sociologists say about crime that makes it interesting? Do you like the idea of differential association? Do you like the idea of labeling? Do you like the conflict approach? Or the feminist approach, which I said I would discuss. Just as I mentioned about African Americans and certain of post-slavery, many of their actions being labeled criminal. Feminist theory looked at certain laws that made women's actions criminal. So we see, many different topics fit their way into crime. But again, just for sake of time, I focused on the broader theories. So of the sociological theories, which do you find most convincing? And then lastly, just before, we have theorizing the law and crime and regulation. So these we've discussed, throughout, so I won't take too long on these. The sociology of law and the study of law, again, laws are the formal codified norms that we have to follow in society. And unlike informal norms, these are formal norms that carry punitive and putative kind of, taboos. They carry sanctions against them. So again, the rule of law based on Enlightenment values and free will and rational choice. No one is above the law, so it does not matter your circumstances in a kind of a pure law sense. Obviously, circumstances do come in sometimes. But in a perfect view, ideal view of the law, there should be no arbitrary discretion. If a law is broken and the punishments are consistent, you do the crime, you get the time, that sort of view. And this is central to kind of national solidarity and social order, in that having stable, clear laws gives people stable, clear expectations about what they can do and what they can't do. So theorizing the law, and this is kind of where it ends. The way that the law is theorized is very similar, so I won't be spending, again, I am more focused on crime and deviance in this course, but this is just some, it's linked. But I think it's pretty self-evident after covering crime and deviance how the sociologists would view the law. So just as we view crime and deviance and everything else using the kind of three core theories of functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism, we view the law the same way. So there's just different terminology, but it's the same thing. So instead of functionalism, we have the consensus view. So the consensus view is that law is neutral and needed for maintaining social cohesion. So yes, there may be problems with the law. Yes, it may be benefiting some people more than others, but we need it to create societal unity and integration. And so here it is applied uniformly and fairly. So this is, when people say that, certain people are disproportionately punished, and then people react to that, and then they say, no, well, they chose to do the crime. It doesn't matter where you're from. You did the crime, do the time. That is someone subscribing to the consensus view. And again, that would be someone subscribing to the strong functionalist view, where they would just say, well, okay, yeah, maybe it sucks that you felt forced to do this, or you didn't have the opportunity, but we need people to follow the laws in order for society to work. The conflict view, on the other hand, has the same name, so as conflict theory. Here, again, it's questioning that and saying, no, the fact that repeatedly certain people find themselves disproportionately arrested, searched, seized, all of that, that speaks to a deeper underlying problem. It could be about protecting economic elites. It could be about, protecting certain groups of people, like men or older individuals over women and younger individuals. It could be about races. It could be about protecting white individuals over racial minorities. But the core of conflict theory is saying, yes, ideally the law is supposed to be some neutral framework, but when and who made it? Laws are made by specific groups of individuals, and they're made by the elites in society, or at least originally, when you look at the foundation of modern states. So conflict is then, and hierarchy is built into the law, so it's not neutral. And then lastly, the interactionist view. They say, okay, both of these are true. Societies have relatively stable laws, and they're stable because they give people expectations and goals about what they can and can't do and how they should live their lives. But at the same time, they're created in times and places are full of inequality. So laws that are still shaping us today were built hundreds of years ago when Canada, for example, was recently colonized. And so you had kind of white colonizers making the laws. And then you see over time that laws tend to lead to minorities being arrested. And so both of those may make sense. So yes, you say, okay, laws integrate and orient us together, but they also may be reinforcing inequality. So the interactionist view says, okay, let's focus on how and why specific individuals both follow and breach the law. So again, it depends on what you're doing. If you want to interview 20 people or do an ethnography and find out kind of how people feel about the law, what it's resulting in, that's more interactionist. If you're focused on, why is it that states around the world develop laws, that would be more functionalist. And then, why is it that states around the world develop laws that come to stratify people and represent certain groups, which is also true, then you would take conflict. So again, theories are always partial in that way because all of these things have truth to them. And so lastly, I put this slide just because you all know it. I know you all get moral panic really well because I got like 30 emails about the Revel quiz having the wrong definition of moral panic. So it's like etched in my brain what it means. But good, you should send me those emails when it's wrong. I emailed Pearson, so they should change it. So I have the definition that many of you sent me. So you're right about that. So the last way that sociologists study crime, deviance, and law. So again, we look at crime, the objective social facts, then we look at deviance, the reaction to norm violations and rule violations, and then we look at the law and risk. So you could have a whole class on risk, but essentially what risk does is it kind of shifts the focus away from institutions and laws and into that morality component that I mentioned in the beginning. So my research on pedophilia, for example, was very linked to the study of moral panics. So a moral panic is essentially when either there is a real level of crime and deviance going on, or it's fictional, so it could be real or fake. But what makes it a moral panic is that it's amplified into a state of crisis. So roughly 100 years ago, reefer madness, or between like the 20s and 50s, reefer madness was like, oh, marijuana's there, everyone's going to get stoned all the time. Same with opioids and cocaine. It's like, oh no, this drug is coming to the country, everyone's going to do this. The recent legalization of marijuana had a lot of that going on as well too. People saying now everyone's going to be high all the time. Pedophilia, there were a string of assaults on boys in the churches in Britain, and that led to the moral panic, saying like, be very careful if you're around a church or around men because pedophiles are all active right now. It was more that was always kind of a problem in many institutions, and then people just, like it was realized then, but it didn't emerge just then, and it's still a major problem. But again, the idea of a moral panic is, you've reached this crisis point, and the media tends to focus on that. And sometimes, again, it thinks, think of the topic, think of which sorts of crimes are really focused on a lot. So again, in certain times, home invasions are really focused on, auto thefts. If there's a string of crimes happening, it'll often result in a moral panic. And some of this is good. If there is a crime spree going on, it's good to let people know that this is happening. But at the same time, crime rates are going down. So anytime you see something about, crime spiking, crime rates have, so recently in Toronto, the homicides that have gone up. I wouldn't say that was a moral panic because homicide rates did go up last year. But many people extrapolated from that, saying, oh, the chief of police, all these things are going wrong. We need to crack down on crime because this is going to keep going. Usually that's not what happens. Crime typically has been going down on most violent kinds of behavior and like severe kinds of behavior, but blips do happen for a variety of reasons. So just questions to think about, and then if you want to go, you can, but you can also stay and get the sneak preview. So questions to think about. Discuss how acts become labeled as deviant. Who's responsible for defining deviance? So again, we talked about moral entrepreneurs. Who defines deviance in your life? Who doesn't? Do you have a say in that? And then explain the differences between the consensus, conflict, and interactionist approaches to the law. Again, so we don't have time to go over assignment 3. We'll do that more next week, but I'll be around if any of you have specific questions. Again, read the instructions, pick your topic. So I've given you, you've had another week to think about which of the 3 research questions you're interested in. Start to think about who you want to interview. And, there's not a whole bunch of guidance I can give you before you do that. And it is due in quite a while. Well, I guess now, just over a month and a half. But next week, we have, I will definitely try to keep the lecture shorter. So we will have time for both my test review and study session, and then Sarah and Ujwal's. And then next week, we also have tutorials, and then you have reading week. And again, I'll send tips about assignment 3 by email. I've been crafting kind of a document responding to frequently asked questions, so that might be more useful. Okay. So I want to make, I have fun. I was telling Sarah, I want them to be memorable, so I want you to remember it for the rest of your life, so whatever works. Oh, okay. One with the text.
Okay, it was more.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's good. That's pretty much what I thought. I knew when I showed my friends this one, and I'm like, well, okay, the one benefit the text plus music has is I made it so what I might do the text one like for the same one that I make a video for, because then you can just like pause it and you have, you know, all the text in front of you. But I know it's not as engaging because it's all long, but I had to do it. Because again, I use that software, and they had that techno song, and I'm like, I want to do it. So, but that's good. I like the talking plus me. So yeah, as I said, that's the easiest one for me to do. So that's great that equal. That's perfect. Okay. So I'm going to do it in that ratio because I still have like 15 or whatever that I want to make. I might make 10, but I'm going to do equal proportion of those two, and then I might do a couple more. Depends, because there's a couple songs I want to put on. So, and I want to, you know, so I'll make maybe one or two of the text ones, and then like 5 each or something of the other ones. And the final culmination, I might have a little bit of each of them. So.
Keep in mind with the text ones that you can pause the video when you're watching it on your own and just read the text. There's a nice summary written by the person who writes the tests and exams of what he's looking for each theory. So,
but they're not as engaging. So I know it's again the pedagogical dilemma of what do you make. So because that's the same script I used that I would have used in the video that I would have made. So like the videos I made, I make like a script ahead of time, and then I look like I'm trying to be like a news anchor. So I put the text like right under the camera. So I make it look like I'm talking. So that's the same idea. So that one was just I'm going to give you the text. So okay. So all right. So if you have any questions about anything, I'm up here. And thanks again for being a wonderful audience. And then you'll expect a new video for next week. I might not make one on the other theories just because I don't want to overweight theory. Post-structuralism leads into feminist theory, queer theory, and a lot of other theory. Sorry, feminist theory was discussed. Into queer theory, post-colonialism, and critical race theory. I may, just for sake of time, I may make that later. I want to get to the methods. So I'm going to make a methods video for next week. And that one obviously lends itself to visuals. So I'm going to try to have fun drawing things. I may do that thing that I did in that video of I might draw pictures and then just like take pictures of myself holding the picture and then add that to a track. So we'll see. Okay, I'll see you next week, and please stick around again from 5 to 6 for the test prep session.